So here's the thing. I was always the black sheep in my family. Not because I did anything crazy or rebellious, but because I had dreams. Big ones. And apparently that was a problem. Growing up, I didn't exactly get the warm and fuzzy support you'd expect from parents. You know, the "I believe in you" kind of thing? Nope, didn't get that. What I got instead were lectures about realistic jobs, safe career choices, and how I should just be happy with what I had. No one in my family really understood why I was always so determined to follow my own path. It was like they couldn't even see my vision. And honestly, I started to wonder if they even cared about my dreams at all. It's not that they were cruel, at least not outright, but they had their own ideas of what I should be doing with my life. My dad always talked about getting a steady job, making a living, and not bothering with these far-fetched goals of mine. My mom, well, she'd just nod along and tell me I was being a little too ambitious. As a teenager, I'd try to explain what I wanted to do, maybe start my own business or go into something creative, and they'd just look at me like I was speaking a different language. I spent years trying to make them happy. I followed the path they thought was best. I worked at the jobs they told me would give me a good future. But every day, I felt like I was suffocating a little bit more, like I wasn't living my life, but rather just playing a part in theirs. It wasn't until one afternoon, when I found a letter in a pile of old mail, that everything changed. I was cleaning out some old boxes in my room when I came across this envelope, sealed and dusty. It had my name on it, but the handwriting was strange. When I opened it, I couldn't believe what I was reading. It was a legal document, but it didn't make any sense. It was like a piece of a puzzle I never knew existed, something my family had kept hidden from me for years. I don't want to give away too much, but let's just say that letter made me realize that the people I thought I could trust the most had been hiding something from me. Something that, once I figured it out, would give me everything I needed to change my life. And that's when it hit me. I didn't need them to make my dreams come true. I could do it on my own. So let's rewind a bit. Growing up, I always knew I wasn't like everyone else in my family. I could see it in the way they looked at me when I talked about my ambitions. My parents were both practical people. My dad worked in an office job, my mom was a teacher, and they wanted the same for me. They weren't bad people. They just had this old-school mindset about what success looked like. The whole, get a good job, work hard, save your money thing. I mean, they probably meant well, right? But as I got older, I started realizing that their version of success wasn't mine. It started when I was in high school. I'd come home after a long day of school and excitedly talk about my future plans. Maybe I wanted to start my own business or do something in the creative field, something that would make me feel alive. Every time I said that, my parents would sigh. It was like I was asking for permission to shoot for the stars, and all they gave me was a map that only pointed toward the ground. I remember one conversation in particular. I had this big idea. I was going to start an online store. It wasn't anything huge, just a way to sell some art and things I made in my spare time. I told my dad about it, thinking he'd be proud of my initiative. Instead, he looked at me and said, "That's cute, but how are you going to pay your bills?" I tried to explain that it wasn't just a hobby, that I could make something real out of it, but he just brushed me off. "It's not a real job. You need something stable. You don't have time for daydreams." That was the first time I realized how out of sync we were. It wasn't about me not trying hard enough. It was about them not being able to see beyond their own view of the world. And for a while, I bought into it. I did the right thing. I got that boring office job, followed the path they laid out for me, and buried my dreams deep down. But here's the thing. No matter how hard I tried to push my dreams aside, they were always there, gnawing at me. There was this constant feeling that I was living someone else's life, and every day it was starting to get harder to ignore. I'd wake up in the morning, go through the motions, but deep down, I knew I wasn't really doing what I was meant to do. Then there was the talk with my mom. I'll never forget this one either. I was about 22, just starting to think about leaving the 9-to-5 world behind and pursuing something I really cared about. My mom sat me down one evening, all concerned. She said, "Sweetie, I know you want to do something big, but you need to be practical. You're not a kid anymore. You can't just chase every silly dream. You need stability. Look at your father. He's worked hard his whole life and it's paid off." I don't know why, but that conversation stung. Hard. My mom wasn't being cruel, but I could hear the doubt in her voice. I could see it in the way she looked at me, like she was worried I'd fall flat on my face. That conversation solidified something for me. I had to prove them wrong. I couldn't keep living in their world of safe and secure. I had to find my own path, even if it meant going against everything they wanted for me. And that's when I started making small changes. At first, it was just taking on little side projects, stuff I could do in my free time. Nothing too risky. But every project, every hour spent working on something I actually cared about, started making me feel more alive than I had in years. I could feel it inside me, this sense of purpose that had been missing for so long. But I was still stuck in that place where I didn't feel like I could completely break free. My parents had a way of making me feel like I was doing something wrong. They didn't outright say it, but the subtle comments and judgment were enough to keep me questioning myself. And it wasn't until that letter arrived, completely out of nowhere, that everything clicked into place. It wasn't just about my parents doubting me anymore. I'd been living my life in their shadow for so long, not knowing that they had kept something important from me. Something that, once I found out about it, made me realize I didn't need their approval to chase my dreams. The letter was a revelation. It wasn't just a document, it was the key to everything I needed to finally take control of my future. So, back to that letter. The moment I read it, I knew my whole world had just shifted. It wasn't just some random bit of legal paperwork. It was a document that revealed an inheritance I had no idea existed. A trust fund. Something my family had kept from me, despite the fact that it was rightfully mine. I had always been under the assumption that my parents were just trying to protect me from unrealistic dreams. But this letter made me realize they were hiding something much bigger. I had always believed that they wanted the best for me, that maybe they were just playing it safe because they thought I couldn't handle risk. But this wasn't just about them trying to protect me. This was about control. They had kept me in the dark about something that could have changed my life years ago, and now I was left to wonder why. I couldn't just let it go. For the first time, I felt like I had power, something that had been kept from me. I was furious. But more than that, I felt betrayed. How could they hide this from me? My parents, people who I thought were always in my corner, had been secretly holding on to this trust, letting me struggle, letting me doubt myself, while all along, they knew that I had this opportunity waiting for me. The anger inside me started to boil, but here's the thing. I wasn't going to just confront them and let it blow over. I was going to play this carefully. I wasn't about to give them the satisfaction of seeing me angry and emotional. They thought they had me figured out, that they could control my decisions by holding this over my head. Well, they were wrong. I decided to start investigating. I went through every little detail of that letter, reading it over and over until the words started to sink in. The trust fund wasn't just some small account either. It was significant, enough to help me build the kind of future I'd dreamed about for years. But they hadn't told me about it. They hadn't even mentioned it once. It was like they hoped I would never find out. The first step was tracking down the lawyer who handled the trust. I knew that would be a delicate move. If I went straight to them, they might alert my parents. But I needed to know everything, and I needed to make sure they didn't get a chance to cover their tracks before I could act. I started by doing some online research, figuring out what I could about the lawyer and the trust's terms. I found the lawyer's name, contacted their office, and asked for a private consultation. I was calm, collected, completely different from the emotional wreck I had been just a few days before. I had a plan. I was going to uncover everything, and I was going to do it on my terms. During our meeting, I made sure to ask the right questions, subtly guiding the conversation until I had all the information I needed. The trust was legitimate, the funds were substantial, and most importantly, it was clear that I was entitled to it. Everything about it screamed opportunity, an opportunity I had been robbed of for years. And as I walked out of that lawyer's office, I felt like I was finally in control. My next step? To prepare. To figure out how I was going to confront my parents, not with anger, but with undeniable facts. They wouldn't be able to wiggle out of this one. They had been hiding this from me for far too long. And it was time to turn the tables, but I knew they would try to deny it. They'd probably act shocked, maybe even try to convince me that I misunderstood, that it was all just a mistake. But I wasn't going to let that happen. I was going to confront them with everything, and I was going to make them regret ever doubting me. While I was preparing, I noticed something else. My mom, who always seemed so composed, had started acting strange. I caught her in a few offhand comments about my future, but there was something behind her words that didn't sit right with me. She was worried, almost too worried. And that's when I realized that they weren't just hiding the trust for the sake of controlling me. They were worried about what would happen if I found out. They were scared. I knew they had been living with a secret for all these years, but now I was starting to see just how much this secret weighed on them. And that was my leverage. It was time. I had everything I needed: the documents, the facts, the proof of what my parents had hidden from me. I had spent the last few weeks gathering my evidence, building up my confidence, and letting the tension simmer until I could feel it in my bones. Now I was ready to strike. I knew I had to be careful with how I approached this. If I just barged in and dropped the bombshell, they'd find a way to manipulate the situation or make me feel guilty. No, I needed to be calm, composed, and above all, in control. One Sunday afternoon, I invited my parents over to my place for what seemed like a casual dinner. I'd cooked everything, making sure it looked like a normal, relaxed gathering. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, but I was bracing myself for the moment when everything would come crashing down. We sat down at the table, chatting about small things, the weather, family gossip, the usual. I kept things light and easy, just as I always had. But inside, I was a bundle of nerves, knowing that this moment would change everything. After dessert, when the conversation had died down a little, I decided it was time. I slid the letter across the table without saying a word. My dad picked it up first, but it was my mom who opened it. The instant she saw the words on the page, her face changed. The room went quiet. "Where did you get this?" my dad asked, his voice a little too calm, a little too guarded. His hands were gripping the letter, but his eyes were darting between me and my mom. I could see it now. He was scared. I didn't even need to say anything. The realization was hitting him just as hard as it was hitting her. "I found it," I replied simply. "The trust, the one you never told me about." I kept my voice steady, but inside, I felt like I was on fire. All the years of feeling small, ignored, and misunderstood were flooding to the surface. I had to make them feel it. I couldn't let them just talk their way out of this. There was a long pause. Then my mom started speaking in a soft, almost pleading tone. "Sweetheart, we didn't mean to hurt you. It's just that we thought you weren't ready for something like this. We didn't want you to get overwhelmed." I could barely contain my disbelief. Overwhelmed? They had been keeping me in the dark about a huge opportunity, one that could have changed my life because they thought I wouldn't handle it? That was the story they were sticking with? "No," I said, my voice cutting through the tension. "You didn't want me to have it because you didn't think I could do something with it. You wanted to control everything, to keep me in your little world where I did what you wanted when you wanted. I get it now." My dad opened his mouth, but he couldn't form the words. He had no defense. He had been caught. They both had. And that's when the real bombshell dropped. I'd kept the final piece of the puzzle up my sleeve for this moment. The trust wasn't just about the money. It was about the control, the way they had manipulated me for years. I had spoken to the lawyer, and the trust's original terms were clear. It was meant for me to use as I saw fit. There was no stipulation that said I had to follow their advice, that I had to stick to their plan. It was mine. That was when I dropped the second document onto the table. The updated trust. The one that had been adjusted after they had tried to rewrite it behind my back. They had tried to make it so that they would have control of it, not me. But it backfired. The lawyer had caught them in the act. they didn't even know what hit them. I watched my mom's face drain of color as she read the updated terms, the realization slowly sinking in that their manipulation had been exposed. My dad, always the one who had thought he was in charge, sat frozen, unable to speak. "You've been lying to me, controlling me, and pretending to have my best interests at heart," I said quietly. "But now? Now it's all mine. Every single bit of it. And there's nothing you can do to change that." The anger, the years of frustration, the resentment, it all bubbled to the surface. I had finally done it. I had exposed their lies, and in doing so, I had reclaimed everything they had tried to take from me. As they sat there, speechless and defeated, I couldn't help but feel a rush of power. They had thought they could control me, keep me small, keep me in line. But now, I was the one in control. They had underestimated me for far too long. After that night, everything changed. My parents tried to reach out a few times, calls, texts, even an email, but I didn't respond. They thought I was angry, which, in part, I was. But more than anything, I was done. I had spent so long trying to earn their approval, trying to be what they wanted me to be, that I had lost sight of myself. And that moment, when I took control, it wasn't just about the trust fund. It was about me finally stepping into my own life without their shadows hanging over me. Weeks passed, and I used the inheritance to launch the business I had always dreamed of. I hired a team, rented office space, and finally started building something for myself. It was everything I had ever wanted: freedom to create, the ability to make my own decisions, and the power to shape my own future. As for my parents, well, they didn't take it well. My mom sent a few more texts, some apologizing and others sounding more desperate. My dad called once, but I didn't pick up. I wasn't interested in their apologies. They had taken too much from me for too long. And honestly, they had no idea what it felt like to be free, to be able to do what you love without the weight of their judgment hanging over you. A few months after everything went down, I ran into my mom at a family gathering. She tried to act like everything was normal, but there was a tension between us now, something that couldn't be ignored. She apologized again, but this time it wasn't the same. There was no excuse for what they did, and I wasn't about to forgive it just because she said she was sorry. "I did what I needed to do for myself," I said to her as calmly as I could. "I hope you can understand that now." She looked at me for a long moment, as if weighing her words. "I just didn't want you to get hurt," she said quietly. I shook my head. "I was already hurting, Mom. You just didn't see it." I walked away after that, not looking back. That was the last time I spoke to her about it. I had moved on. My life was mine now, and I didn't need their validation anymore. As for my dad, he never really came around. He continued to send me messages, usually short ones asking about business or how I was doing. But there was nothing behind it, no real interest, just a sense of obligation. It didn't matter. I had gotten what I needed from the situation. They weren't going to be part of my journey, not in the way I had once hoped. And the business, it grew. Slowly at first, but the momentum kept building. I was doing what I loved, and for the first time in my life, I was finally in charge of my own destiny. One day I woke up and realized that I had become everything they had said I couldn't be. I was running my own company, making the decisions, taking risks, and reaping the rewards. I wasn't just surviving, I was thriving. As for my parents, they were still stuck in their ways. They never really understood why I did what I did, but they couldn't deny the success I'd built. They couldn't deny the person I had become. I didn't need their approval anymore. I was my own person, and nothing could take that away.